I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the National Infrastructure Commission itself and talk to you about the importance of infrastructure before I hand over to the fantastic panel to run through each one of the principles and what it means to them. And then I hope we're just going to have an interesting discussion for the rest of the time allocated. Maddie is going to be the fabulous assistant who's going to...
I'm going to share my screen.
I'm going to do this, I hope, in a kind of 5 minutes canter through my slides, although I can't see any of my notes now. I'm so technically incompetent, so I'm just going to make it up as we go along. No, right. Okay, thank you, Maddie. If you want to go to the next slide. Okay, thank you. So the National Infrastructure Commission was set up 2015 to set a long-term vision for the country's infrastructure needs. It's really with the kind of understanding that we need a long-term strategy so that there's proper investment, understanding about what's actually going to happen, and to sort of set some priorities for government. So government has to respond to the National Infrastructure Assessment. If you don't mind, Maddie, next slide. Oh, see, I'm way ahead of myself. Actually, no, if you go back one, I'll... Okay, great. So, yeah, so we were set up in 2015, and we have a very clear charter that that was set down by the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne. And as I said before, we have a remit that means that we respond to government around infrastructure needs from a great amount and deal of work that's done by a fabulous secretariat. There's 8 commissioners, of which we report every 5 years with the National Infrastructure Assessment. I will ask you to go forward. We have a fiscal remit, so the recommendations that we make have to fit in between 1 and 1.2% of GDP every year, and which is a very large sum of money, probably going to increase in the spending review. So the work of the Commission is incredibly important, and really does sort of define, I think, the trajectory of the government's infrastructure spend, which is why it's so important that when we think about how and what we prioritise, that we do so in the sort of widest sense of things. Maddie, next one. So every 5 years, in relation to the parliamentary cycle, we produce a National Infrastructure Assessment, which is a plan of action for the UK's infrastructure for the next 10 to 30 years. We do that every 5 years, so it's a kind of fluid document. The first National Infrastructure Assessment made a number of recommendations. I won't read them all through, but we are now, this was submitted, and we're now waiting for waiting for government to respond with its national infrastructure strategy. We've been looking forward to that for about a year now. It's postponed because of Brexit, and now because of COVID, but we do expect some significant not only significant reactions to the recommendations in the spending review, but hopefully the strategy which will come thereafter. Okay, next. One of the biggest achievements of the National Infrastructure Assessment, from my point of view, was the focus on design. So one whole chapter in the National Infrastructure Assessment was given over to design, and a number of recommendations that were made to government around design, which is that all nationally significant infrastructure projects should have a board level design champion and use a design panel, so that we really, after a number of some significant research that we had undertaken, we really did understand that the industry just really, didn't understand design and the importance of design. And as part of those recommendations, we also said to government that we would set up a design group and develop some design principles that would cross-cut all infrastructure of national significance, which we did. And after a really rigorous and nationwide launch and look for fabulous members of that design group, we now have 8 counting. It's been a long day. Amazing commissioners and members of the design group, 4 of which you will hear from this evening. And in February of this year, I think it's probably time I went, Maddie. In February of this year, we launched the design principles, which I have to say is it's a first for the UK. I think the first ever in the world. I don't think there's any design principles for national infrastructure that have been published anywhere else. So we're incredibly excited about it, and we've had as much as we could have, having gone straight into COVID and lockdown after the principles were launched. Real kind of positive feedback from industry, and we're very, very excited that the recommendations that we've made will not only be picked up in the infrastructure strategy and response from government, but that we can actually, when talking about infrastructure projects and those who work on infrastructure, from the CEO to the sort of technician, that everybody understands that design is their responsibility. And we hope this is the kind of first step towards really embedding great design, climate, people, place and value in terms of perspective into the infrastructure industry. I'm going to hand over to whoever's next now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sadie. And what we're going to do now is just take you through each of the design principles from our perspective. But as we're talking, please do ask us questions in the chat, and we'll pick them up afterwards. So do challenge us. So as a civil engineer and an infrastructure designer, a lot of the focus of my work is in developing solutions that both mitigate carbon and are resilient to the impacts of climate change. And there's 3 key points that I want to make in relation to climate design principles. And the first is, if we are going to meet our net zero carbon and also deliver on the levelling up agenda, we have to invest in the right project at the outset. We know to deliver net zero, this will continue to include investment in renewables and decarbonisation of a power network. But with 1/3 of emissions coming from transport, we also need to radically rethink our approach to mobility. And I think we all know that prioritising active travel solutions will support that path to zero carbon and deliver healthier communities. But yet our infrastructure investment mechanisms in transport are completely opposite to what we should be prioritising. And this is a piece of work done by Scottish Parliament, but the same is true nationally, that our investment still focuses on car travel first. So good design comes out of choosing the right project at the outset. Next slide, thanks. So the second point is around embodied carbon. Operational emissions in infrastructure assets are typically much smaller than the life cycle carbon and embodied carbon over the life cycle. And we should also note that about 85% of our infrastructure that we will have in 2050 already exists today. So we need to maintain and upgrade those existing assets. So we need to talk about materiality and reducing those life cycle embodied emissions. So our research and evidence shows, no state, previous slide. Shows that in order to realise those benefits, we need to focus much more on design. So my colleagues have been working at Old Oak Station, and through a systematic review of the design assumptions and refinement of all the components, we're able to take almost 1/3 of the material out of the previous design of the roof, and with associated cost and carbon savings. So if we invest in that upfront design, there are wider value benefits. We also need to challenge our design standards. They're way out of date, written at a time when we had far less computational power, and they don't take account of improvements in the construction process. So a really detailed example, again from the work that we're doing with HS2, is on reinforcing steel, one of the biggest materials that we use in the construction sector. In design code terms, it has a strength of 500 newtons per millimetre squared. In reality, we know it has far more than this. So we can believe we can take 10% out of that without reducing or without impacting on performance. So that might seem a sort of marginal gain, but when you scale that up across the route, scale that across the industry, it is significant. But we also need to move towards more transformative innovation. And this last image is of a zero carbon platform made from ultra low carbon deck that sits on top of a timber structure and a radically reduced foundation. So that gets us to net zero carbon. So there's much more that we can do, but this is the space that we need to be looking in. So good design is really about challenging the approach to materials. And the last slide is about the adaptation side and building resilient communities. And what has really changed over the last couple of years is people's understanding that this weird weather that we are seeing is climate change happening. And so we need to design communities so that they are resilient and comfortable microclimates. This is the wetland bowl on the Olympic Park, now the Queen Elizabeth Park, where I was responsible for the water strategy. By creating space for water, we were able to take 10,000 homes out of the floodplain. What is really great about the wetland bowl is the integration of surface water drainage, wetland habitat creation, and the delivery of a really beautiful park, which has great amenity value for the people that live locally. And just before lockdown, I visited the park and I actually saw a kingfisher darting around the reeds. So this is a real significant measure of success, especially given what was there before. So good design is about bringing different design disciplines together, in this case, landscape designers, ecologists and engineers, and in that collaborative team, creating multiple benefits for environment and for people. And that hopefully is a good segue over to Madeleine.
That was very smooth. Thank you. So our second design principle is people, and that's because people are really central to infrastructure and what we're trying to do. Often we think of infrastructure as heavy engineering-led solutions that are designed in a way that don't necessarily put people first, but ultimately it's people, you, me, everyone here this evening, that will be using our infrastructure. And so we really wanted to communicate the importance of infrastructure being designed for people and not just architects and engineers. And so infrastructure is a complex conversation that we need to consider at every scale. And the world operates at multiple scales at the same time, and we need to consider the micro and macro in tandem from the earliest stages when designing and thinking about infrastructure. So just as the Charles and Ray Eames Powers of 10 film is hinged around the human experience, so is infrastructure. And all projects, no matter what their scale, are ultimately rooted in the experience of human beings, from the touch of a warm wooden railway seat to the arrival sequence in a city. And the people principle is really an opportunity to make sure that us human beings are put at the centre of a project from the earliest, most strategic stages right the way down to detailed design. And as part of this, we're communicating the importance of engaging meaningfully in a diverse and open way at every scale to ensure that people who will be using the infrastructure, the communities who live nearby, and the workers who build and maintain and operate it are all taken account of, and that their diverse needs are reflected in the design too. So last year, Sadiq Khan announced plans for 100 new water fountains in London, which was really amazing. This was an opportunity for an infrastructure network that could be really iconic and world-renowned, but the result, whilst functional, was somewhat disappointing. And the studies on the right-hand side that were commissioned by the Architects Journal in 2014 show that when the diverse needs of people are thought about in different ways, there are opportunities for water fountains to go beyond just providing water. They can also create gathering spaces, places to meet and bump into people, and to really think about human beings and how we use the city in multiple different ways. And so there's somewhat of a disconnect between decision makers and the design industry. And like all the design principles, the people principle is an opportunity to try and challenge and change the way that everyone involved in an infrastructure project understands and thinks about design. And so by placing an emphasis on thinking about people at every stage of a project, we can better integrate infrastructure into our public realm and rethink infrastructure as spaces that aren't just utilitarian, but also bring people together. So there are some really interesting examples whereby considering the different communities that a project impacts, infrastructure can become an opportunity to provide amenities and spaces that don't necessarily directly relate to its use. So for example, in Tokyo, a seawall is designed to allow for an allotment, allowing local residents and apartment blocks nearby the opportunity to meet and get to know one another. And a water treatment plant provides the opportunity for a publicly accessible park in what is otherwise a very dense urban area. So putting human beings at the heart of projects has countless benefits, helping new infrastructure to enhance and enrich the lives of the community it serves. And our cities and infrastructure are all about people, and this principle seems ever more relevant and important as we now look to evolve our infrastructure in the midst of this health, social, economic and environmental crisis that we're in.
Thanks, Maddie. I'm going to pick up places. What's interesting with infrastructure and places is that these places stretch from being enormous. You know, if you've got an enormous piece of infrastructure that crosses the country, all the way through to a very site-specific place in a city. I'm going to cheat a little bit and just paraphrase some of the text from the design principles document. On behalf of the design group, we believe well-designed infrastructure supports the natural and built environment. It gives places a strong sense of identity, and through that forms part of our natural cultural heritage. It makes a positive contribution to the local landscapes within and beyond the project boundary. We want projects to be inspiring in form and detail, respecting and enhancing local culture and character without being bound by the past. In addition, we believe good design supports local ecology, which is essential to protect and enhance biodiversity. We want projects to make active interventions to enrich our ecosystems. They should seek to deliver a net biodiversity gain, contributing to the restoration of wildlife on a large scale, while protecting irreplaceable natural assets and habitats. So that blend of human culture and nature is fundamental to responding to places. And I've got three little projects. So this is the Megget Reservoir in the Scottish Borders, which was finished in the early 80s. And it's won many, many awards for the very beautiful way the dam has been integrated into that landscape. I don't know if people remember, but there was the BBC Design Awards. It won the design award in that particular year. It was entered. And today, I mean, that landscape would be maybe challenged in terms of should it be sheep farming, should it be rewilded? But basically, this is once again an example of an integrated project: landscape engineering, ecology, farming, resettlement, all those sort of aspects that come together to make this an amazing, beautiful place. The next one moves into a city. It's my home city of Bath, and it's a World Heritage Site. So how do you integrate a new design infrastructure into such a setting? Behind there, you've got Pulteney Bridge, designed in the late 18th century by Robert Adam, a multifunctional infrastructure, bridge, shops, and it carried a water main. And in the foreground, you have a 1970s, 80s piece of flood relief infrastructure, which is a very beautiful weir. And together, they probably make one of the most popular places to photograph in the city of Bath. So it's that sort of contribution in a sensitive, beautiful way to creating places. And the final scheme is basically coming down again in scale into a very topical contemporary world of green and blue infrastructure, and how do we redesign, adapt, transform traditional infrastructure to meet the demands of today and tomorrow. So this is the Greater Green project in Sheffield, which is basically transformed for lanes of dual carriageway and taken two of them away to provide this amazing piece of drainage infrastructure, flood relief infrastructure, creating amazing biodiversity, offering beautiful access for people, and really significantly actually opening the opportunity to enhance the value of the place and open up the opportunities for reinvestment and regeneration of a whole sector of Sheffield, which then translates into Anthony's bit on value.
Thank you, Andrew. And so I can't see the slides in front of my screen. Are they still up?
Sorry, my computer cut out. I will reshare the screen.
Okay, so whilst the slides are coming up, I wanted to take us through a journey about value. Now? Yeah, I can see that now. Great. Thank you, Maddie. yes, I wanted to take you, well, you and us through a journey about value, and I wanted to start that journey in 1825 with this image, which I always think is an absolutely fabulous image, which is an image of the opening of the world's first passenger railway, which was the Stockton to Darlington railway, which evolved from a colliery railway, which was developed to haul coal. And yeah, the coal came from pits at Bishop Auckland, where originally horse-drawn tramway was used on a line joining two markets for coal at Stockton and Darlington. And then from 1825, the use of passengers commenced. And this image really makes me sort of reflect on what was the value of the investors and the constructors and of the early builders of that railway. Were they doing it only for a monetary sake, i.e. to make a profit, or were they doing it for other reasons? And I think it's really interesting, the Stockton and Darlington Committee, the seal that they designed to represent their company showed wagons being pulled by horse, and it had the Latin motto, and excuse my pronunciation, Periculum Privatum Utilitas Publica, which means at private risk for public service. So even those early railways, one would imagine they weren't just doing it for monetary reasons. So if we could fast forward to the year 2020, Maddie, and go to the next slide. So this is an images of a selection of typical passengers that would use the UK railway infrastructure in the year 2020. And I put this image up for us to reflect on, are our demands as passengers in the year 2020, are they any different to the passengers that travelled on that first railway service in 1825? So we all as humans have a desire to trade in one shape or form or another. We all have a desire to communicate. We all have a desire to be tourists. We probably all want to do that as quickly as possible. We probably want to do it in a degree of comfort and have services offered to us on the way, such as retail offerings. So have our needs changed in the year 2020, almost 200 years after the year 1825? So if we could go to the next slide as another example to reflect on. And St Pancras is generally accepted as a good example of infrastructure. And I thought this image is a really interesting image to reflect on the value of design. And St Pancras is statistically UK's most popular railway station, and it ranks almost all of the time top in the National Passenger Survey for station satisfaction. So it's become more than a railway station. It skillfully integrates high street and a business centre and a hotel under the magnificent roof of the railway station. And so infrastructure is looking beyond the moving people from A to B in this case, and yet good design in this case has shown how the value adds much more to the basic purpose of getting A to B on a railway. If we could move to the next slide, which was an image taken a few years or so ago. And this is Glasgow Queen Street Station. And I thought this is a really interesting image to reflect on how did the design process ever get to this type of solution, and what value was considered in the development of the brief for Glasgow Queen Street Station, which is hidden away at the back of that image. But yeah, how many roads do you have to cross in order to get to the railway station? Where is the railway station? The public realm outside the front of the railway station, and how it integrates into the surrounding area. This site is currently undergoing a major redevelopment within Glasgow Queen Street. So it looks very different to this at the moment. But I thought a very interesting image of how value in the design process can sometimes go quite significantly adrift. If we go to the next slide. So the Green Book provides guidance on how to appraise projects, but does it provide and capture the broader social benefits and dynamic effects of major infrastructure projects? How well Is it applied to major infrastructure projects? And the Institute for Government, in their publication, How to Value Infrastructure, highlighted some of the challenges of applying the Green Book to infrastructure schemes. So in my short journey through time, where I've gone through almost 200 years with a number of images to reflect on, I hope I've left you with some images that show good design does add value, defining issues from the outset and providing a direction, and that infrastructure and design is more than just a monetary or monetized item. There are much wider value benefits to infrastructure and design, and one has to look beyond the getting from A to B in the case of railway to look at the wider benefits and the wider value of infrastructure projects.
Thanks very much, Anthony. You managed to beat us on the 3 slide rule. So, as mentioned at the beginning, if you want to put in some questions into the chat, please do. And perhaps whilst I've got Anthony's attention, I can ask him a question to get us going. And you know, we're all very keen to understand from the design group how the principles are going to land in infrastructure organisations. And so I wondered if you could say how Network Rail are taking them forward, and maybe also give some insight into what other infrastructure companies are doing.
Yeah, so within Network Rail, we published our own set of design principles in 2018, our principles of good design, which are freely available on the internet. So it was a publicly available document. And in 2018, I was really keen that we set the design principles as our high-level strategy and our design vision almost. But we have tied those in to our engineering and design standards. So when a project within Network Rail undertakes a piece of work that affects the built environment, the project has to demonstrate in the design submission how they're meeting our design principles. We are just in the process of updating our design principle to include an additional design principle, and at the same time that we're updating our design principles, we are linking directly to the National Infrastructure Commission design principles, and the strategic principles of the National Infrastructure Commission sit really, really well with the Network Rail principles. So my understanding of other infrastructure sectors is that they're doing the same. Highways England has published their own set of design principles, and I believe they're also considering how they can showcase how the NIC principles fit within their own.
Okay, in the absence of more questions, I'm going to take your your observation about the Green Book, because that has been coming up a lot this week. You showed the report on maximising social value, which has also been launched by the ICE this week and makes recommendations for updating the Green Book. And I wondered whether, Sadie, you could perhaps let us know how you think. It feels like there's a good reception in government to sort of talking about you know, the wider value case, and maybe say something about how government is looking to take that forward.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, my sense is that, you know, we're pushing at an open door in relation to all the design principles, and every time that, you know, every time I'm in a meeting, whether it be with Homes England or the National Infrastructure Commission, you know, the conversation is much richer, it's much wider, the perspective. When we're talking about the levelling up agenda, for instance, we're not just, you know, it's not just in relation to the National Infrastructure Commission, we're not just talking about what that looks like in terms of physical infrastructure, but how might that permeate through and really add value in relation to diversity, in relation to socioeconomics, in relation to really sort of understanding the richness of the nation as a whole. So my sense is that we are, you know, this is a really good time to have these conversations. It's a really good time to highlight these issues, because we're not, you know, government agencies are really open to the sort of help that we're offering. And to go back you know, to Anthony's point, you know, the National Infrastructure Commission principles were always supposed to be sort of a high level umbrella under which agencies could, you know, one would hope develop their own principles if they hadn't already. So Network Rail already has one, Highways England has one, HS2 has one. So, you know, if we can encourage all infrastructure sectors to think about climate, people, place and value when they you know, when they not only procure projects, but I mean, right from the inception through to sort of the procurement, through the concept, through the design to the outcomes, and then measuring those outcomes and allowing us to really understand the value that you know, the kind of bigger picture value that's that investment has unlocked, then I think we'll be in a situation where that it will, you know, business cases, you know, the way in which we cost our infrastructure will have a whole new dimension to it. And you know, I think Anthony really explained that well. You know, if you look at something that's been properly designed, properly integrated, properly thought through, has real placemaking, adds value in a really, you know, sort of much more cohesive and rigorous way to the places that it impacts, whatever the kind of infrastructure it is, whether it's a great example of Maddie, you know, that, you know, sort of a flood barrier that becomes an allotment. You know, we're talking about these sort of, you know, adding value in ways that hasn't ever been on the spreadsheet before. And that's what's really exciting.
Great. Well, we've got a question come forward from Luke. Luke, would you like, you've been unmuted, so you can ask your question directly. Thank you.
Oh, hi there. Yeah, sorry, I thought we were just doing it by message. I didn't realise it'd be on video. Hi. Yeah, so I just wanted to ask, so going back to the second principle that Maddie raised about, you know, making people first infrastructure. So there's some good examples of that kind of applying to the smaller local projects. And there were examples from around the world of it applying to some of the kind of more heavy infrastructure and the bigger, you know, multi-million, billion-pound projects. But there's not too many really spring to mind recently from the UK. You know, there's a history of this with, you know, for example, the Bazalgette sewer and the Thames embankment that came from that. But there's not really too much I can think of in terms of big infrastructure projects that have fed into the public realm in the UK. And what's the reasoning for this, and how can we change that?
With the public realm question, I think if we start at Andrew, do you want to pick that up, and then maybe Maddie can come in as well?
Yeah, I don't think I'm qualified to say why we haven't invested in the public realm or integrated the big infrastructure projects in that sort of holistic way. I think there are examples that haven't gone forward. I suppose that's one of the things. I mean, I'm thinking of the Swansea tidal barrage, which was controversial, but actually would have offered lots of really amazing benefits across the board. But you know, the government decided they weren't going to pursue that at that particular moment. What else can I say? I mean, I think there's a huge, basically, let's not look back. I mean, I think we've got to look forward, because basically there is an emphasis coming forward that we're going to be building new infrastructure. We need to build new infrastructure that's fit for the 21st century, the future. And I think on the back of the principles that we are talking about, things should change. Let's hope they change.
And Maddie, sort of picking up on that point, but also the sort of, you know, the young professionals network and maybe the skills and appetite for change coming forward.
Yeah, so I think it's a really great question. Thanks, Luke. I think there are a few projects which are coming through, like the Thames Super Sewer, which Claire Donnelly on our design group is working on, and that is providing new pieces of public realm, like above some of the places where otherwise you just see heavy infrastructure, which is quite interesting. But I completely agree with you that on the whole, like, it almost seems like infrastructure has just become really siloed and about like what its specific function is, rather than thinking more holistically about these schemes. And that perhaps partly it's that we need to rethink what value means, and the metrics behind that, that it's not necessarily just like an immediate financial gain, that it, you know, also like if you're affecting people's mental health and their well-being, like that has additional value to a project, which can also, you know, through roundabout ways be really beneficial financially in the long run, as well as for people's health. I think also just maybe partly it comes down to the fact that we're increasingly working in these silos. Like you used to sort of have the master builder, or like you used to sort of, it seems like you used to have these people who sort of oversaw like a lot more things, and increasingly we just all oversee very specific elements, which sort of means we're all kind of operating in these very kind of closed worlds, rather than talking to one another and realizing we have the same ambitions and goals, and how do we actually get there. And I think that's something which hopefully the principles will really help with, because it will help everyone to see that we're all trying to actually achieve these same 4 goals, and hopefully bring the conversation back to them. And then with the young professionals panel, which I was on, which Judith was talking about, which Sadie set up like 2 years ago, has been amazing, because it's a group of 16 people from completely different backgrounds, and we all get around the table and actually sort of really want to change things and challenge the way things have been historically done, and look at how we can really get our voices heard, because often the people who are making decisions are the people who aren't necessarily actually going to live to see those decisions play out, and don't necessarily also recognize what it is that future generations want or need. And so I think things like that, trying to create more intergenerational conversations is really important as well, and hopefully will change things.
And Anthony, you started to touch on how Network Rail is changing and trying to put back some of that intergenerational sort of perspective. Do you want to comment further on what Luke's driving at, Luke's question?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really resonated to me. It just in many ways, but I was discussing it earlier on today with my team in a slightly different context, but with a similar sort of outcome. We were reflecting on work which we're undertaking at the moment to publish a whole new suite of design guidance for Network Rail, and we were reflecting on identity and why the passenger hadn't been put first for a period of time, or that lack of connection to a human within railways as such. And we looked back at time in the past, so in the 60s, where there was a sort of explosion of focus on design in the railways when the corporate identity manual was produced by British Rail, and then in the late 80s, very early 90s, where there was another sort of explosion and focus on design in UK railways. And we were reflecting on why does it seem like certainly within the rail infrastructure, there's been an ebb and flow on focus on design, and therefore the connection to a human. And I think in the areas where it ebbs and flows and that there isn't that focus, is because infrastructure can become unitized and not actually consider the human, that it is the oil that makes the infrastructure system operate. And in the times when their design then acts as that oil to ensure that there's that focus. And so I think things like the National Infrastructure Commission Design Group, us publishing the design principles, is really helpful to bring us out of a trough into a focus on design within the world of infrastructure.
So, and your chairman, Pinter Hendy, sort of said infrastructure is done to people, not for people. And I think that's really pertinent, and it sort of speaks to how people feel about infrastructure. And I think if you can, for me personally, if you can start to communicate the benefits of infrastructure, then you'll get better public support for infrastructure. And somehow we need to create a more demanding public around what their infrastructure should provide. And I wondered whether Sadie might want to comment on, because we said in the design principles the sort of need to engage broadly to get wider perspectives on infrastructure design. So the role of public participation and engagement to bring forward those perspectives to inform better infrastructure design. Sadie.
Yeah, I think that's exactly true. And I think we've made really big advances in community consultation, understanding communities' needs when it comes to sort of residential development, and the sort of I mean, there's still plenty of, there's a long way to go, but at least it's understood that in order to make kind of properly integrated kind of residential development, you need to ask communities what it is that they want, and how is it that they how to make sure that the decisions that are made really do reflect the community's needs. And I think that when it comes to big infrastructure projects, people just don't, I mean, they're not that engaged, and it's, I find it really, and because people aren't engaged, I mean, it's a sort of vicious circle. There's such huge projects. They tend to come from central government. They generally go through parliamentary process, which is sort of, if and when you are able to make comment, is very combative. It's not, it's not generally a process that really from the beginning of it starts to understand what it is that matters, how to best integrate infrastructure, how best to reflect the community's needs. So everybody's starting from a kind of position sort of 3 steps back. It's not natural. There's not something that is necessarily done well. I mean, that's not to say that some big infrastructure projects haven't started on that process. HS2, have a community consultation program. Other big infrastructure projects, highways projects do, but it isn't as sophisticated as this kind of residential housing model. And I think there's a big effort that the industry, the infrastructure industry, the engineering kind of, all of us actually need to do, which is to say, actually, it's one of the, infrastructure, particularly over the next decade and thereafter, is going to be a really big part of our lives. If you listen to government and you hear about how we're going to build our way out of the sort of COVID crisis, it's all about infrastructure. So we're going to be seeing a big investment, and with that investment we have a huge opportunity to, yes, make it greener, yes, to sort of make sure that the infrastructure that we're investing in really does think about the future, but also that it reflects people's needs. But we need to design the process better, because it almost doesn't exist. So I think that that's the challenge, and the challenge is to actually engage and infuse communities and individuals to sort of get involved and to be interested, and or perhaps to understand that they have a choice, or they have an opportunity to influence the outcome, and that, I think, is probably the right place to begin.
Yeah, I think it's hugely exciting when you get community engagement involved in projects, because it does take you in a different direction. I'm just hoping that we haven't put people off asking questions by putting Luke on the spot and having to come to the screen. But do thank you very much, Luke, for that question, and do put more into the chat. In the meantime, I will ask Andrew a question, because I think both you and Anthony looked at the sort of heritage examples, and it strikes me that historically we've had far fewer disciplines involved in infrastructure design, and what we've evolved is in some quite detailed specialized disciplines. And I wondered, what environment are you used to creating to bring teams together to have a conversation about design, and how does that collaboration work in practice, and how could it work better, Andy?
Well, I mean, I think what's very clear in the work that we do recently, if we're doing sort of master planning studies or reviewing significant large projects, you tend to bring together an extraordinary array of disciplines. For instance, we were just recently asked to produce a proposal for a landscape and biodiversity strategy for a piece of city. And typically that would have been, a landscape architect and ecologist going off and doing some nice drawings, but actually to make it really resonate with policy and what people want, we brought in mobility specialists, lighting specialists, people who could really understand how we could analyze ecosystem services, economists, all these sort of layers of how do you get the best out of that particular challenge, that particular problem. And I think that probably is going to apply to many, many different projects. In different, you get different teams, different assemblies of disciplines for different projects. But yeah, it's definitely my experience that is what's happening.
Very good. And I think just maybe what we should do is end on an observation from each of us from the panel. I know we've got sort of about 10 minutes left, is that right, guys? That we are in a quite unique moment at the moment with lockdown, and lots of us are talking about the opportunities and what we've learned from this new experience. We've basically changed the way our cities are functioning without actually changing any of the infrastructure systems. And so I think what would you take from where we are now, and how does that represent some of the design principles? Maybe if I go to Maddie first, what do you think we learn from the situation we're in at the moment that we can take forward?
Yeah, we're at a really interesting point where I think firstly everyone is just so much more aware of their environment around them, and what's going on, and sort of engaging with their built environment and infrastructure and cities, and also getting to know their neighbours. And there seems to be this kind of newfound appreciation for how important kind of neighbourly spirit and getting to know each other as people is. And at the same time, because things need to evolve so fast, we're seeing infrastructure projects like happen at a temporary scale, but very fast, which is really exciting because it means that you can get things done almost like without too much red tape. So it's a really good opportunity to test ideas. So the fact you're seeing all these new cycle lanes spring up, even the fact that like you see people sort of reclaiming their streets, like just putting bollards out or planters out and starting to really test what they can do with spaces and what it is they want and need from their city is really interesting and really exciting. And I hope something we don't lose and we sort of build on. And I think it's almost everyone saying what it is they want to see through a very physical means, which is really important to listen to. And I think perhaps we need to sort of address the fact that there is so much red tape and things take so long. And how do we sort of take it, speed these things up? And I suppose our 4 principles kind of are at the heart of what it is that everyone wants and needs. So how do we sort of have this joined up vision and voice going forward?
Oh, I think it's so good. Such good points there. And Anthony, the red tape issue and also what we've experienced around mobility, that must be something for you to take on.
Yeah, that's a challenge for any large organisation, isn't it? And I suppose Network Rail were no different in that respect. I wanted to mention about integrated teams. That I broke the 3-slide rule this evening with a few extra images, and I also had a couple of others that I deleted in getting down to my breaking the rule images. But I did have one of an image of a drawing office from the 70s, and how the number of different people involved in producing design is so key to maximise value of that design, or to meet all of the other elements of of our design principles. And yeah, during the COVID crisis, it's really made me reflect on how infrastructure is so key for resilience of the nation. And yeah, non-railway just for a moment, but in those very early days of lockdown, where the highways were actually the key for our strategic distribution networks, the digital infrastructure systems were key to allow us to keep communicating. Water systems, so our basic human needs are absolutely reliant on infrastructure to provide solutions and allow us to keep operating. And then and finally the railways, although we haven't had many passengers utilising the railways, it's been a key set of strategic UK freight networks, and without that set of freight networks, then the implications are quite significant for the country. So yeah, the crisis has made me heightened the focus that we need on infrastructure now, and the need for when we come out of the crisis, how it can help improve our economic situation.
Yeah, no, it's very, very pertinent points. I think the thing about reclaiming the streets as well from people perspective, and how that is aligned with placemaking, Andy, you know, the fact that we are reclaiming our streets, and also we've been able to see what the benefits are of green space and green infrastructure. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, just before the COVID outbreak, I mean, the climate and biodiversity agendas were absolutely driving everything in terms of what we were working on. And on the, you know, as part of that, clearly a real tangible awareness amongst people that the things need to change. So low traffic neighborhoods and activism and changing things, and, you know, trying to sort of promote, you know, let's change how we live as a sort of a very street level, is really, really powerful, actually, because it sort of suggests that there's an appetite to change, there's a need for us to change the way we think about, you know, the life infrastructure that we have around us. More green space, you know, better access to better air quality, easier to walk, cycle to the places you want to get to. All those sort of aspects are really, you know, they're very simple human sort of things that I think we can start to build on. I think the other thing in terms of infrastructure is that, you know, using technology we're using tonight, communication, digital technology, it's shone a spotlight on how important it is to talk to each other, and actually how important it is to have these tools in the modern world. So there are, you know, many layers of infrastructure, I think, that are sort of weaving into what our future lifestyle is going to be about.
I think it's a huge opportunity. I hope we don't bounce back to normal, and that we do take the lessons forward. We've got a question from Ellis, and then perhaps we can tie that into some comments from Sadie as well. So Ellis.
Thank you. I just wanted your observations really about how the conversation we've been having tonight intersects with British planning culture. And we have a kind of planning culture which kind of it really is focused on development control rather than making propositional plans in the way that we'd understand that you know, the way that might be delivered in Germany or Switzerland, say. These areas, these sites of new infrastructure, obviously, are locations which have vast repercussions beyond their immediate site in terms of the kind of future development of territories. Do you have confidence, or are you optimistic that, oh, I'm framing that badly. How does it get anxiety that the current development culture, present planning culture, isn't really capable of steering the subsequent transformations that any infrastructure project might set in motion, regardless of how well the stations are designed, or the public spaces outside, or the immediate landscaping? When it comes to what the private sector delivers when a major new station opens, how do we ensure that too is designed in a considered fashion?
Yeah, Sadie, I think that's a perfect question for you.
Well, I think there were kind of lots of different questions in that. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that if in order to get the best out of any infrastructure investment, you need a proper strategic plan. You need the infrastructure needs to fit with, a whole raft of other kind of issues that perhaps we're not as good as we should be at coordinating. So you have, central government trying to, with the job of kind of national infrastructure fitting into local plans, and then you need the coordination to make sure that if you're landing new bits of transport infrastructure, that ties in with development. That means that you don't have, overlaid with where the flood risk is, where and where the where digital and energy infrastructure kind of fits into that. So it's incredibly complex, and I think hasn't really been given the kind of proper scrutiny that it should have had for many years. So we had a system that was broken up, and now we're trying to find a way of doing it quicker, faster, but more efficiently. And I think with the kind of the digital applications and the technologies that we now have coming out of the Bartlett, for instance, I think there is real opportunity to make these big decisions in a much more kind of thoughtful and integrated way. How do you ensure developments around stations are, sort of the public-private partnerships are working as well as they can? Well, you basically have to make sure that throughout the procurement process that they're embedded early on, and that they're not, that you don't take those decisions halfway through a project, because you're never going to get the integration that you need. So I think that when it comes to big infrastructure projects, there needs to be an understanding from the outset what the public-private partnerships look like, and how and who benefits from what. And that's a whole other question. But we need much better mechanisms to make sure that the value that's created by the public purse in investment in infrastructure is the public are properly rewarded for it, or the taxpayers properly rewarded for it.